Bricks and Minifigs is your one-stop shop for all things LEGO. Hit the link below to find a store near you.
Caden Burton here. I'm at World War Brick this time, not Brick Fair Chantilly. And we are going to be looking at the third mock in the operational timeline for the Battle of Okinawa that I started back in 2022. So what we're looking at is essentially the 6th Marines' second assault on Mount Yae-Take on Okinawa between April 7th and April 17th of 1945. When we initially landed on April 1st, the early reconnaissance of this area was extremely lacking due to cloud cover. So the initial assault failed because we were really unsure as to where the Japanese were, how the defensive positions were set up. So through some patrolling around the outskirts of the Matubu Peninsula, we were able to locate a map that better showcased the defensive positions, roads, and trails that led into the mountain. But the hierarchy of the Japanese resistance in the north was centralized here. So Lieutenant Colonel Udo Cho, who was the commander and officer of the 96th Infantry Regiment, I believe, of the Japanese Imperial Army, was here. He had a garrison of about 2,000 Imperial Japanese infantry and then an unknown number of trained local guerrilla fighters. The second assault, we attacked from two sides, essentially forcing the Japanese up and out to the summit of the mountain by blowing up the machine gun nests, cave openings, everything they possibly had, where we could use naval, air, and ground artillery to kind of blast them out.
Yeah, and just the scale of this is really incredible here. So when you first look at this, obviously you got the base around the mountain, but then you look at the huge mountain here and how big this is. So what is the overall size of this whole layout?
So it's 55 by 55 inches wide, and then the mountain is nearly 3 feet tall at its highest point. So the substructure underneath, most of the mountain face sections themselves are extremely sturdy with filler brick, and a lot of the substructure is using Technic to create essentially like hollow stationary points to be able to build on top of.
Yeah. So then as we're looking here at kind of the battle going on, obviously the minifigs catch your eye as well. Do you know how many minifigs are on the entire layout?
I want to say we're just shy of like 200 minifigs total between all the Japanese soldiers in the caves and then all the Marines outside. There are figures in each of like the little portholes where you see machine guns and stuff as well. So if we add it all up, it's probably just shy of about 200 figures total.
Okay. So as you move into the mountain here, what are some of the kind of scenes that you've included with some of the action as you're kind of moving into the mountain paths?
So the whole idea was to create pretty much as much, to use as much of the lighting as I possibly could. And I started with the caves. So the caves allowed me to kind of create the Japanese side of the story. But the Marines on the outside, I kind of have, everywhere there was an explosion, there's something going on that's kind of formatting that. So on the front end, we have grenades getting tossed in, we've got the tanks shooting up to the other ones, and then kind of the mirage of some naval artillery hitting the top of the mountain in the back.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get these different textures here? Because it's usually, we're used to seeing a lot of gray rock work, but you've worked in all these other textures and even colors to the build.
Sure, so that was one of the big techniques I wanted to play with. So it's using the Lego nets, which allows you to kind of create a malleable landscape. That was the one big technique I wanted to work into the mountain. I've seen it used a lot for kind of low flowing landscape, but not necessarily as brutally vertical as this. It was definitely a challenge, but I think it came out really well. It definitely breaks up the big gray blob that would just be a sloped up mountain. And it, from the few places that it slopes up from the ground itself, it kind of fills all the way up to the top where you get back to the kind of the earth tone landscape.
And as we move to the top over here, what do you have on the top of the mountain?
So on the top is the Japanese defenses that were on the outside of the mountain. So you have a trench system, there's a machine gun nest on the far side and a mortar pit on the front edge that does actually connect to one of the caves. So it's kind of breaking the fourth wall. Like we have all the caves that are deep in the mountain, but you have the one that is what would essentially be in the mountain that also then comes out to the exterior.
Mm-hmm. And take us through each of these caves if you can and explain some of the scenes here. Lots of action going on.
Yeah, so the whole idea behind these was to kind of show the different formats of how the Japanese forces utilized the interior fortifications of the mountain. So the one you're looking at now is essentially like the Imperial Officer Command Post. So you've got a map and a lantern in there to go over defensive strategy. The next one up actually will feed all the way down into one of the machine gun nests you can see on the front of the mock. So you can look all the way down in there and see the machine gunner. He'll flash through. The one in the corner, you've got a radio operator down in the front, but then you also kind of have the depth perception of forces coming from far deep within, and then again walking back even further. And the one all the way down at the bottom is the kind of the big idea of seeing a very large troop movement, that they were able to essentially construct these caves and systems that they could move a lot of man and material very quickly from position to position. And then the last one that gets you to the front of the mountain is essentially we see kind of the tactic of blowtorch and corkscrew coming to work between grenades and flamethrowers to essentially work case by case to eliminate the Japanese soldiers on the inside.
And as I mentioned earlier, obviously the mountain is like a huge scale here. So what does it take to build at this scale? You've included the caves in there, but what are some of the internal structures like?
So it's a lot of filler brick. There's quite a bit of Technic, which is the first time I've really employed Technic to my advantage of structure. All of the nets are mounted with ball joints, so it created a little more tedious because then you're going not just by bricks tall, but also by plates tall. So I had to add some additional pieces here and there to make sure that everything kind of blended together. The caves I built into the mountain sections first, and then kind of blended everything over the top of that in order to kind of anchor all of those slopes together. But it also gave me a pretty good basis of where certain things were going to be. The height of the mountain was one of the first things I did when I framed the build out. I had the wall that went all the way up, and then kind of went back in and did the cutouts to add the caves in. But
how is that structurally then with those nets in there? Does that stay together pretty well as you're transporting this around?
Yeah, all of the nets are also interconnected to each other, so, and they're all individually anchored. So the section being pretty tough by itself, there are additional pieces underneath that kind of hold it in place as well. So it breaks down total into 25 different sections that all get individually packed, but it made it all the way here, so I must have done something right.
Perfect. So we'll move back down to kind of more of the American sections around the outside. What are some of the tanks and kind of troops that you have represented out here?
Sure. So this is essentially depicting companies of the 6th Marines, and the 29th Marine regiments that would have been assaulting at this point. So it's the same figures that I've always had. One of the big things of note this year was that I switched over from yellow minifig tone to entirely flesh minifig tone. That was something I've wanted to do for a couple of years, but flesh is rather expensive. So, but the Shermans are the same. The one big thing that I employed this year that I was really happy with how it turned out was the tread marks, or the tank track marks. So on all three of the Shermans that we can see out on the side, you have kind of these drop down reddish brown tracks of where they were coming from.
It adds such a great level of realism to the build when you can do things like that. I also love the way that you've positioned the different soldiers here. So just kind of hiding behind the tank, and then really heavy use of the lights as well, which I think really make things pop.
Yeah, so Light My Bricks helped out tremendously with this project. They were able to help me supply a lot of this. There are, I believe, if we're talking connections and wires, there's probably close to 300 individual elements that make up the electrical circuit underneath that powers everything. Because everywhere where there's not a just like standalone light, everything's either flashing or flickering, which are all, then again, effect boards that dramatically extend the circuit that much further.
Mm-hmm. And I know you're no stranger to landscaping, and like you said, you've done builds in this series already, but what were some of the particular challenges of this build, or did you try any new techniques for either the ground around the mountain or the mountain itself?
So the groundwork, this is actually the first time that I've done this level of landscape on a square frame. So both Kadena Airfield last year and the landings that I did in 2022 were on freeform landscape. So the base height for this build is 4 bricks tall. Most of that was to be able to put the nameplate on the front of it, but the building up to that height then also, I mean, A, it used a lot of filler brick, but 2, building everything to a certain height to match up with all of the ends of other base plates that it meets was really important. So each section I had to kind of build around at the same time to make sure that the stuff actually matched up. I think the biggest challenge really was the nets and employing those and working them into the mountainside, making sure that it seemed not necessarily super linear. There weren't a whole lot of straight edges, although they come out to straight edges, but to break it up as much as possible.
Yeah. I think you've done a really effective job here. So, do you have plans to display this at other shows in the future here?
Yeah, so this is the second of 6 shows this will be at this year. It'll be at Brick World next weekend, Brick Fair in August, and then Brick Universe and Brick Erie in September. And then it will get torn down and sorted to start the next project, which will be the 4th of 6 for Okinawa.
Okay. And it's amazing how you spend years going through these battles like this. I think it's so cool to see your progress. Where are you at in the research for that? How does that process typically go for you as you're doing this kind of over the course of years?
So I have a very kind of broad umbrella of just generalized research for a battle, and then when I kind of have narrowed it down to a specific piece of the battle, I will then take that into account and go even further and try to find as much as I can. For this specific build, the reference material that I had was rather lackluster, and it was also a lot of them said different things, so it was kind of a little bit more of creative liberty than I normally take. But as far as like the mock itself, there aren't a whole lot of pictures either, so a lot of it came from maps and then kind of creating some substructure of what I know would have most likely been happening in some sense. I have a PowerPoint presentation on my computer that is I got from my 9th grade history teacher of Japanese defensive positions and like how they built them, how like where they used them, all that kind of stuff. So that came in quite a bit of handy as well. But the few maps that I found and some of the pictures helped to kind of get a generalized idea, and then I kind of took that a step further.
Now, you have been building military builds like this for a lot of years now. Have you found the reactions from the public changes it all over the years, or is there anything that kind of takes you by surprise as someone walks up to a build, obviously of this size and kind of depicting a very realistic battle?
I think it kind of depends. A lot of it, like especially now that I'm adding a lot of the research element to it, a lot more people appreciate kind of the story behind it. But when you come up to stuff like this, especially like the scale and then obviously the lights also make it pop a lot more. So you get a lot more wow factor with those aspects of a build. And one of the things with like last year's build, Caden Airfield, it was kind of just this dark tan circle. There wasn't a whole lot going on. So I bumped up the intensity for this year, because this is also technically the first Okinawa build where there's a firefight going on. Both the landings and Caden Airfield were uncontested objectives. So this is the first real test of U.S. forces against Japanese forces on the island.
Well, I'm glad you're continuing to tackle these battles. So thanks for bringing this out to the show here, and can't wait to see it at more shows later in the year as we see you around. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.